Welcome to the Academic Writing Amplified podcast. On this podcast, we believe that the culture of academia needs to change radically. Women and non-binary people are revolutionizing academia within institutions that were not built for us. If you're ready to reject the culture of overwork, kick guilt and overwhelm to the curb, and amplify your voice to make a real impact on your field without breaking down or burning out, you're in the right place. With our team of experienced writing coaches as co-hosts, we'll share insights and talk to inspiring guests to bring you the practical strategies, systems, and mindset shifts you need to find time to write, publish work you love, and design your career on your terms. And it all starts with writing. Let's go. Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Academic Writing Amplified podcast. My name is Kathy Mazak. I'm your host and the founder of Scholar's Voice, a professional development company for women and non-binary professors that helps professors write and publish more so that they can create the career and the life that they want. I'm so glad you're here today. If you didn't know, we have a newsletter that you can sign up for at scholarsvoice.org. If you scroll down to any of the pages, the newsletter is called In the Pipeline, and you get weekly helpful writing advice and tips and book recommendations. So if you like this podcast, then you might like In the Pipeline too. So go ahead and jump over there, scholarsvoice.org, and sign up. Okay. Today's episode is called Interrupting Default Practices. Whew. So I was thinking about the default, and I've been thinking about like the power of operating in default mode. One recent example of this for me is that I was driving from my house to my friend's house. So I was driving this road that I drive every day, at least twice, if not 4 times a day. It's like the way out towards the city and the way back, right? And I'm driving and I start thinking about where I have to drive later and kind of like picturing the route that I'm going to take. And then I had this moment that maybe you've had before where you kind of wake up from your thoughts and realize you're driving. It was like I had gone far into my head, and to make it like even weirder, what I was doing in my head was like picturing my route to the next place I had to go. And so when I woke up and I was like, oh, but here I am. Wait, I'm driving. It was like very freaky. But of course, I'm sure this has happened to you before. And this is a great example of the default practice, right? Like your muscle memory can do something as complex and frankly dangerous as driving a car on autopilot. This happens too, right? When instead of driving to a doctor's appointment, you drive to school, because normally at 7:30 on Monday through Friday at 7:30 a.m., you're driving the kids to school, and your body, your muscle memory, your brain is just defaulting to the normal, the regular, the everyday. And even though you're supposed to be driving to a doctor's appointment, you end up taking the turn to drive to school. So this got me thinking about kind of like the power of the brain in default mode. It's very powerful. It's like it wants to do default things. Like the brain saves energy by operating in its normal habits, right? It's normal everyday practices that have been developed and ingrained over time. The brain is happy there because you don't have to like invent something new or make like more decisions. So as you are operating in default mode, you are reducing your decision making. And for people like us who make I think like hundreds, if not thousands of decisions every day, you understand why you keep trying to operate in default mode. So let me explain like the connection to writing. I think a lot of us are operating in default mode when it comes to our writing practice. So the last episode, I talked about writing practice versus process versus pipeline and kind of like my most recent thoughts on all of that. And the connection, I mean, it's kind of an obvious connection. When today's podcast, which actually today is last Tuesday, if you're listening to this in real time or the day that it drops. And when I looked at the title of last week's episode and it said, your practice drives your pipeline or whatever the title was, I was like, oh, that felt really important when I recorded it, but now it seems a little bit obvious. Like, of course, your writing practice drives your pipeline. But the problem is, I guess, when your writing practice isn't driving your pipeline and you end up with a backlog of papers. And I think one of the reasons that our writing practice isn't driving our pipeline the way that we want it to, or the way we kind of need it to for getting our next grant, our next job, or even like getting our next publication out, like getting things out so that you can publish the next thing or that you can get promoted, right? Or get a new job. All of those powerful things that publications get us. When that is stalled out, what might be happening is that your writing practice is happening in default mode. You're defaulting to whatever has become the default writing practice for you. And so if you find that you have what we call a stalled out or clogged or backed up publication pipeline, in other words, I would say you have between 3 and I've seen people with even up to 10 or more, depending on their fields, partially written articles or, things that it might not be an article, but like pieces, papers, maybe things that they want to write and publish. You have 3 to 5 of those projects, like in some form of process, in some amount of words on the page or some figures or something. That's a backlog. That's a backlog. I would say if you have more than 3 to 5, then you have a straight up backlog of papers. And even 5 can be a backlog of paper depending on your field. Some people are in fields that articles are shorter and the timeline to publish is also shorter, like the turnaround times are shorter. So it kind of depends on your field. I think that backed up pipeline or that backlog of papers, one reason for it can be that your writing practice is operating on default. So let me describe what a writing practice that's on default mode might look like to see if it resonates with you. And then I'm going to explain how to interrupt default practices. So how to break out of default mode with some key questions. And those key questions will help you break out of default mode for anything. So any kind of practice that you're doing on default can be helped with these interrupting questions that I'm going to say next. So let me first, though, describe what a default writing practice might look like. Now, let me note, you got to see what this is for you. But here's some default writing practices that I see happening that are causing or are the reason that you have a backlog, that clients or potential clients or listeners to this podcast have a backlog of papers. So you could be doing what I call the binge and bust method. This is where you wait to write until you have what you perceive to be the kind of unscheduled time, which often ends up being when you're supposed to be on break, resting and recuperating from the semester. So binge writing can happen during spring break, which is coming up, right? During the summer, right? A lot of people talk about summer writing because many academics use the summers to kind of quote unquote catch up on their writing. Some people use or try to use the winter break or the holiday break to catch up on writing or to do their writing. I don't even want to say catch up. Like if it is a recurring way that you do writing, then it is a writing practice. Okay. Then it is your writing practice. I want you to think about what your writing practice is. Is it that you kind of just hold on to your writing, put it to the side, and then try to do it in a binge when you have a break or something like that, or you have summer or something? Another way that binge writing shows up is if you do have a paper that has a deadline, right? Like maybe there's a special issue or there's some other reason that your writing has a deadline, then you bust your butt right up to the deadline. You kind of like let everything else fall to the side and you write like crazy right up into the deadline and then turn something in. That's another form of binge writing. Now, of course, as I've said before on the podcast, the problem with binge writing is the bust that comes after it. It's not sustainable. But let's be real. Like, this is something that many people do. So no judgment about it. In fact, the questions I'm going to ask you later, are going to help you if that is your writing practice right now. Okay. Other writing practices are that you try to schedule writing, but you are having trouble with the boundaries around the time. So it is hit or miss, right? So you have it on your calendar, but you're not hitting it every week with consistency. So your writing practice looks like, oh, I do an hour or two every couple of weeks. And that's okay. Like, hey, that could be fine unless you have a backlog of papers. And then that is not going to help you get your backlog of papers out as efficiently and quickly as you potentially could if you tweaked your writing practice and were able to hold boundaries throughout that time and be a little bit more consistent. So those are things I see a lot. And it's not like, and it's like, of course, because you have defaulted to that writing practice is what seems possible right now without a lot of effort. And then here's some things that some people have tried to do to interrupt those default practices or to create a new writing practice and why I think they don't work. So sometimes what people do is they read a book. I have a book. It's called Making Time to Write. I would love for you to read it. I think you would enjoy it. But sometimes we read a book and we think we're going to change everything, but we don't, right? Because we haven't interrupted the default practice. We've just learned something more. And I think this is true about lots of project management books. There's so many project management books out there, time management books. And because academics like to read and we're like, I'll learn it. We read a lot of those books, but then actually making change, actually interrupting the default practice is harder. It takes something more. Let me say this. It takes something more than just wanting to. I think that writing practice is actually a lot like good nutrition and exercise. Everybody knows, or most people know what good nutrition looks like. Most people know you need to move your body every day. But the distance between knowing it and doing it is really far. It's hard because, and one of the reasons that it's hard is because whatever nutrition you are doing now is your default. And whatever movement you're doing now is your default. And so interrupting that default takes effort. All right. None of you are afraid of effort. You've been giving your all to many things. So let me talk about the reason that you're not doing the effort for your writing practice. And I think it has to do with the power of the default. Okay. So here we are at the questions. All right. These are questions for interrupting your default writing practice. I will reword them at the end so that you can use it for any kind of practice. So here's what you need to ask yourself. How has my writing practice served me in the past? First, I want you to identify your writing practice. What is it now? And then I want you to think back to your past with academic writing. And I want you to think like, how did this work well for me before? One example. A lot of times binge and bust writing comes from our grad school years, right? Like we binge and bust because in grad school, like our papers had deadlines at the end of the semester, right? And so we would kind of like, we could maybe pull an all-nighter or like really, work our butts off for the 5 days before we had to turn it in and turn something in. And we could do that with success. So what we would write in 5 days would be pretty good, like good enough, like probably A's, right? For grad school, and you would turn it in. Similarly with the dissertation, probably you wrote your dissertation in a binge. I mean, I know that I did. It took me a long time to do the analysis, do the data gathering, the analysis. But when it came to writing, you just have to like sit down and do it. And for me, was I working? Yeah, I was teaching at the same time as I was writing. And, I was just like trying to write every spare minute when I was writing my dissertation. So that worked because I published my dissertation, I turned in my dissertation. So that's like an example of how we create a practice out of some kind of necessity, but then we continue to use that practice even if it's no longer serving us. So that's why the question is, how has this writing practice served me in the past? When was it, like looking in the past about when this way of writing was successful and helped you achieve your goal? Right now, this practice is leading to a backlog of papers. But when was it successful? How was it successful? Because I bet you can find a time that it was successful. All right. The next question is like maybe a little harder, maybe a little bit, a little dicey. How is this writing practice serving me now? Here, the assumption is, and I think this is really important, that your writing practice is serving you in some way right now. And what way is that? I'll go back to the nutritional example. Okay. So you have like a certain set of foods, or let's say with like, maybe you eat out a lot or you order in a lot. Because you're busy, you need to conserve the decisions you make every day, conserve the amount of time you spend on things. You use DoorDash and you get something delivered many times during the week. That is serving you, right? Like it's solving problems for you. It's solving the problem of like, I want to eat something that's relatively yummy. I don't want to have to cook it myself. I don't want to make a big mess in my kitchen because if I order out, then I'm not like, I don't have a lot of dishes to do. There's a lot of reasons that that's serving you, right? So think about like your writing practice. If you're doing binge and bust writing, how is it working? Maybe you can really write up against a deadline, Maybe your binge and bust writing is helping you to manage an overload of work during the semesters by pushing writing to the margins, pushing writing into the breaks, because you have too much on your plate. So the binge and bust practice helps you manage what's on your plate by pushing writing to the side. We need to acknowledge that. How is the writing practice serving you? And then the last question, how is the writing practice no longer serving you? So it might preserve some of your energy during the semester. It might feel good to like not worry about your writing, like almost compartmentalize, right? Like leave your writing to the summer and then you worry about it then, and that feels good to you. But what's happening is it's very stressful once you get to the writing, and then you don't have a great relationship with your writing, and then you have a clogged up pipeline. So how to interrupt default practices, ask yourself these questions. So I'm just going to repeat the questions, but without writing, just going to say practice. So you can think about this, not just about your writing practice, but about any practice that you need to interrupt from a default. Yeah. How has this practice served me in the past? That's question number 1. Number 2, how is this practice serving me now? And question number 3, how is this practice no longer serving me? When you have the answers to those questions, then you can start to think about, okay, what new practice do I want to create? And what effort am I willing to put into the creation of that new practice? But you have to understand how keeping that practice is working for you, how it's accomplishing something. Because when you finally understand that is when you'll be able to say, okay, I can see brain, why you're trying to operate on this default, because you established this default when it was working in these ways. Now it's still working in this way, but it's not working in this other way. So that is really the first step to interrupting default practices of any kind, but especially default writing practices. Where did it come from? When did it serve me in the past? How is it still serving me now? And then how is it no longer serving me? Which maybe is the easiest question to ask. Once you have the answers to those, then you can find the real reasons to change. Because if not, since your default practice is working you're keeping it. You're just letting the car drive you to school when you need to be going to your doctor's appointment or whatever. All right. I hope that this has been helpful to you. I encourage you to think about your writing practice as worthy of your time and effort, worthy of these reflections. Remember, of course, that in our Navigate program, we teach you how to establish your writing practice. We call it your soaring system, and that is part of our Navigate program. And clearing time and space for writing is also part of that program. So if the reason you've been binge and bust writing is because you're so overloaded during the semesters, then Navigate might be a good option for you. You can get on the wait list for when we open the program again. And we will run a session this summer that I believe starts May 15th and ends July 31st. So you want to get on the wait list now, and you can do that at scholarsvoice.org/navigate. There you will see a big pink button at the top of the page where you can sign up. It says get on the wait list if the wait list is open. And if our enrollment is open, it says apply now. Then at that same page, you can read all about the program, see if it's something that you're interested in. And I really encourage you. I know that this episode is coming out February. And so I'm telling you to think about May. You might want to do the Navigate program. You really want to start thinking about this now. You want to get on the wait list now. Getting on the wait list is just signing up to get information. It's just signing up to get the enrollment dates, to learn about our application process, because we do have an application process for the program, to learn about pricing. So get on the wait list. It's just will help you get information in a timely way. And you can do that again at scholarsvoice.org/navigate. Until next time, have a great day. Bye.
Thank you so much for spending your valuable time supporting yourself and your writing by listening to this episode. If you like what you heard today, the best way to say thank you is to hop on over to Apple iTunes and write an honest review. The more reviews, the more amazing academic women and non-binary people will find this podcast. So go write one now.